Rome wasn't built in a day, but it did fall in a day. And while the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire would go on to exist for another 1,000 years after that, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD has had a huge impact on our world. So what if Rome never fell? What if the Western Roman Empire not only survived, but thrived? Would we speak Latin instead of Spanish or French? Would we have no Renaissance or Reformation? Would we be living in a glorious high Renaissance right now? The reality is probably not. But it's still fun to speculate. In our actual history, the Western Roman Empire was already very different from the original Rome of the Republic and even the early Empire. By the time of Augustus, Rome had changed from a republic to an empire, expanded dramatically in size, taken on many foreign cultures, adopted Christianity, and just generally grown into a totally new beast. But there are some versions of Rome that never fell, where Rome is still a republic. And that's not really all that interesting. It doesn't seem likely that Rome would go back to the way it once was. So we're going to ignore those versions of Rome that never fell, and focused on ones that are similar to how it actually evolved. The biggest difference between the later Western Roman Empire and the earlier Roman Republic or early Empire is, of course, slavery. Slavery was widespread in the Mediterranean world, but the Romans took it to a whole new level. At one point, there were more slaves in Rome than free people. In fact, the Romans often imported so many slaves to work in their agriculture, mining, and other industries that they devalued the labor of free people, which led to unrest and instability. If Rome hadn't fallen, it seems likely that slavery would have continued to cause problems for the empire. So let's see what happens if the Roman Empire abolishes slavery in 476 AD. The first thing to consider is how we get from 476 AD to the present day. If you look at the history of any country, there are always a few major events that stand out. France, for example, had the French Revolution, World War I, Charles de Gaulle, and a bunch of other stuff. If you take out a couple of key figures or events, the country's history can change pretty drastically. So let us try and figure out what key people or events we need to keep around to ensure that Rome doesn't fall. Let's start with Theodoric the Great, King of the Austrians, who conquered much of Italy for Rome in the late 400s. In our timeline, he was actually made King of Italy by the last Western Roman Emperor, Romulus. But in this version of events, Romulus survives and rules alongside the... Now, don't worry, this isn't going to turn into a Game of Thrones episode. Instead of Romulus being deposed by his Germanic mercenaries, they team up with Theodoric to defeat other Germanic tribes that are as chill as the Goths and help stabilize the Western Roman Empire. After Theodoric, let's fast forward to the Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries. This was a period of cultural and intellectual revival in Frankish territory that helped lay the groundwork for the European Renaissance. Without the Carolingians, we wouldn't have had the Renaissance, which means no Shakespeare, Michelangelo, or, you know, me. So let's imagine that the Carolingians also happen in our alternate timeline, except instead of happening in the Frankish kingdom, it happens throughout the Western Roman Empire. With the increased trade and cultural exchange that comes with being part of a stable empire, the Carolingian Renaissance quickly turns into a full-blown Roman Renaissance. By the 1300s, Rome had become the center of a massive empire. Not unlike the British Empire of the 1800s, they had colonies all over the place and were exporting massive amounts of culture, technology, and wealth. And while the eastern half of the empire might be culturally distinct from the West Roman Empire is big enough and diverse enough that it is impossible to predict what kinds of differences might develop between the two halves. It is possible that the eastern half could remain Greek-speaking and Orthodox Christian, while the western half adopts Latin and Roman Catholicism, but it is also possible that the two halves will both adopt Greek and Orthodoxy, or Latin and Catholicism. Or maybe they develop their own unique cultures entirely. All we can say for sure is that the further east you go, the less likely it is that your average person speaks Latin. Another big question is how technological development would be affected by a longer-lasting Western Roman Empire. After all, the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain, a country with a long history of political stability compared to most of Europe, so maybe industrialization starts in Rome instead of Manchester. But what about the scientific revolution or the digital revolution? Well, it's hard to say. In our timeline, the scientific revolution started in Italy during the Renaissance, before moving north to places like France and England. Perhaps the same thing happens here. After all, Rome was already a major center of science and learning in the Middle Ages, so maybe Rome doesn't fall, but it remains a city-state. In this version of events, the rest of Italy becomes like a patchwork quilt of independent Italian states, like the Medici-controlled Grand Duchy of Tuscany or the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa. And while these Italian states duke it out, the Holy Roman Empire grows in the north, perhaps conquering all of Gaul and even pushing into the Byzantine sphere of influence. Eventually, the Ottoman Empire sacks Rome and the Italians are like, sweet, and then they all get along. Another possibility is that Rome falls to the Ottomans, who then rule a massive transcontinental empire stretching from North Africa through Italy and into the Balkans. This version of events is pretty unlikely, though, since the Ottomans weren't known for their ability to hold down Western European territory. It's also worth considering what the New World would look like if Rome didn't fall. After all, the Americas were discovered only a couple of decades before the fall of Rome. It's not hard to imagine Rome colonizing the New World instead of Spain or Portugal. But if that happened, would the language of Brazil be Latin instead of Portuguese? Or would the Aztecs have learned Latin? Probably not. Language tends to be pretty sticky, especially in the Americas where indigenous languages were mostly wiped out by colonial powers. Even if Latin was the official language of the Roman colonies in the Americas, it's more likely that local languages would continue to be spoken at home. Or maybe Rome never falls and continues its slow decline into Iraq. In this version of events, the eastern half of the empire thrives, while the West Roman Empire becomes increasingly marginalized. A world where Rome never falls is basically a world where Western civilization never happened. And given that I'm half Western and half civilized, I think that would be a pretty dang sad world. If you liked this video, check out my video on how Genghis Khan changed the world. You should also subscribe because why not?